Welcome to the Integral Stage. In our broader integrative meta community, and on the integral stage as well, there's been a lot of concern recently with what John Vervaeke calls the meaning crisis. The meaning crisis isn't new, it's been growing for centuries or longer, but it's receiving renewed attention right now, perhaps in part under the growing tensions and magnifications enabled by social media and various technologies which are breaking down old barriers of time and space and forcing the painful birth of a more global consciousness if we don't first collapse and regress. Back in the late 70s and 80s, there were already intimations of the potentials and threats of these conditions, and a number of thinkers attempted to address them, from David Bohm and Krishnamurti to Fritjof Capra, Joanna Macy, Ken Wilber, Henryk Skolimowski, and others. For me, David Bohm's work is especially consonant with John Vervaeke's project. From his position as a scientist, a quantum physicist in his case, Bohm began to reflect on and attempt to address the breakdown in meaning he was witnessing, the fragmentations in consciousness and culture that were leading to untold and perhaps largely unnecessary conflict and suffering in the world. And like Vervaeke, for Bohm, one of the primary ways forward toward the cultivation of greater wisdom and insight was through the practice of dialogue, not just regular conversation, but a deeply somatically rooted process of inquiry and transjective encounter. From fairly early on in his work on dialogue, Bohm was joined by Lee Nickel, a teacher at one of Krishnamurti's schools and a deep thinker in his own right. Over the years, Lee helped Bohm to refine and implement the practice of dialogue, and since Bohm's death, he has attempted to take the practice further, most recently through the exploration of and experiments with Bohm's concept of holomovement or the Holoflux. In the discussion that follows, we'll get into just what Bohm meant by Holoflux and how it relates to the process of dialogue and to the deep transformative work needed to begin to address the roots of our present meaning crisis. Well, hi, Lee. Welcome. It's great to have you here.
Thank you, Bruce. It's great to join you.
I first reached out to you to invite you to participate in my TSK series. And one of the main reasons that I'm talking to TSK practitioners is because of contemporary concerns around the meaning crisis, as cognitive scientist John Vervaeke calls it. And the meaning crisis is a pervasive feeling of alienation from self and alienation from the world. It's marked by the loss of a coherent worldview, maybe the loss of a sense of being meaningfully participant in the world, and various breakdowns in sense making and communication, some fragmenting and growth thwarting polarization, identity politics, a lot of things that people are feeling that we're tangled up in right now and having a hard time to see our way forward. And so I've been talking to TSK practitioners because I think TSK has something useful to say about this, and maybe even more importantly, some useful ways of working and inquiring that can maybe address some of these problems and open them up. But with that said, I think that the work that David Bohm did, and by extension that you are doing, really speaks very powerfully to this crisis as well. And it's from a different angle, but I think one that's very consonant. And so I'm looking forward to exploring that with you. But the first thing I wanted to start with is just getting a little background from you. How did you first come across David Bohm's work, and what attracted you to it?
Well, the first time that I ever heard David's name or anything about him was in reading one of Krishnamurti's books. Let me think. It was called The Awakening of Intelligence. I was quite young then, maybe 20, maybe 21, somewhere in that vicinity. And the book itself, of course, is very potent and very wide-ranging in a typical Krishnamurti way. And then I was very surprised at the end of the book, the last chapter in the book is a conversation with this physicist named David Bohm. And I was really deeply taken with that exchange, that interchange between the two of them, which had a very, very different feeling from the talks. The rest of the book is really transcriptions of talks from Krishnamurti. And potent as those were, they did not have the same spirit as that final chapter, which was, the back and forth between Krishnamurti and David Bohm. So that really captured my attention. You could say in a way I was hooked. But I never envisioned that I would meet either one of them, much less come to know David very well and spend many years working with him. That came sometime later, but that was the beginning. That's how I first encountered his work.
I think we have, something very much in common there. I think I was probably exactly the same age, maybe just a little bit younger, when I encountered his work. And it was also through Krishnamurti. And I think it was also actually through that book, which then prompted me to go out and get some other books of dialogues between the two of them, as well as David Bohm's Wholeness and the Implicate Order. So, for our talk today, I'm thinking mostly we're going to be talking about some of Bohm's ideas around the Holoflux and how they relate to his whole dialogical project. But again, before we get into that, I'd like to know a little bit more about your resume and your work with him, because that's such a remarkable opportunity to be able to meet him and work closely with him. So would you be able to say anything about, the kind of work that you've done with him and with his ideas? Obviously, I know it has to be broad brushstrokes since that's, I think, 40 years or so, but, whatever you'd like to share about that.
I think the starting point there would be, of course, meeting him initially, which was around 1980 or 81, which was 6 or 7 years after I had first read this dialogue between Bohm and Krishnamurti. And through various twists and turns of life, I ended up teaching at the Krishnamurti School in Ojai. And at that time, the Bohms, David and his wife Sarah, would come every spring to Ojai and stay for a number of weeks. It's hard to remember, I think 6 to 8 weeks in the spring, something like that. And they stayed in a compound where Krishnamurti lived, and I was also living in that same compound. There was the original house that Krishnamurti lived in that vicinity, called Arya Vihara, which is now the Pepper Tree Retreat. And then Mary Zimbalist's home, which was through an orange grove, and just maybe 50 yards from Arya Vihara, which is where Krishnamurti and Mary lived. And then 20 yards from that house were then the offices of the Krishnamurti Foundation. And above those offices was what came to be known as the Bohm Flat, which is where David and Sarah would stay when they were in Ojai. So it was really that proximity that led to all these many years of sustained contact with David. We would have dinners together nightly at Arya Vihara. When I wasn't teaching, we would have lunches together. Usually those were bigger gatherings that Krishnamurti himself participated in. But the evenings were much more intimate, with trying to remember David Moody and his then wife Vivian, and Michael Cronin, who was Krishnamurti's chef, and myself, and one other teacher, I think, from the school, lived in Arya Vihara. And so we would have dinner with the Bohms almost nightly, with 5 or 6 people total for weeks on end. And, that's a kind of convivial circumstance, and it leads just to very relaxed conversation, not anything formal. And it was really through that kind of interaction that David and I developed quite a close, trusting relationship. And that just expanded as the years continued.
That's wonderful. As we were discussing off the recording, I'm really appreciating the overlap of some of our biographies, having also worked at a Krishnamurti school in India. I first experienced Bohemian dialogue at Ojai, at the school there. I went to one of the summer gatherings, and I was getting involved too late. I didn't have a chance to meet Krishnamurti or David Bohm at that time. It was Professor P. Krishna who came and led a Bohemian dialogue at one of the summer gatherings. And that was such a powerful, transformative encounter from, with people from maybe 20 different countries there, and the level of and depth of sharing and communication was just really impressive for me, and kind of, helped the next few years unfold under that inspiration. So in thinking about, Bohemian dialogue and your work on that, there's a lot I want to ask you about, but I noticed one thing that you talked about in your book, Entering Bohm's Holoflux, that, I'm going to kind of touch into some of your writings here periodically. And one of the things that you mentioned there was that you were talking to David Bohm about the dialogue method, and he said that he felt there was something missing as it was manifesting at the time, and you didn't have a lot of opportunity to go into what was missing, but he did mention that he felt that people should be doing more work outside of the dialogue sessions to basically inform them and maybe support them in the dialogue work. And what that made me think of, maybe 15 years or so ago, I met Ken Wilber, and in a conversation with him, I mentioned my interest in Bohemian dialogue. And at the time, Ken Wilber was very dismissive of that. And he said, Bohm's dialogue doesn't take account of levels of development of individuals, and therefore it's always going to founder. It's not going to work because there are, communication problems across levels of development, or there's actually certain developmental requirements even to be able to do what Bohm was asking people to do in that process. And I resisted his suggestion that, Bohmian dialogue could be dismissed on those grounds. I really felt I experienced it, in many contexts over the years, and I found it to be effective and a beautiful process. But it does sound like, David Bohm was acknowledging that there does need to be some kind of additional developmental work, some kind of self process to support dialogue that he felt was maybe missing in some contexts. Would you agree with that, or what do you think about that?
Well, there are many aspects to what you brought up here, Bruce. So we could begin to touch on a few of them, and if some are left out, maybe you could bring some others in. That conversation that I had with David, where he said he felt one of the weaknesses of dialogue was that people weren't doing enough work on their own outside of the group. That's the last time I ever talked to him. It was on the telephone 10 days or 2 weeks before he died. And we had a number of things on our agenda, and we moved fairly quickly through most of them, including this point about dialogue. So it was really left there that he felt that people were not doing enough work on their own. And I've always taken that to mean, and I'm fairly certain about this, that he was referring to the much larger context of dialogue, that many people who at that point had begun to participate in the process were either unaware of or dismissive of. It's hard to say. So let's look at that a little bit. As Bohm himself said quite clearly, there are really three facets of dialogue. They're not linear, they're not progressive. They're really like facets of a jewel. And one is the individual, and one is the collective, and one is the cosmic. These are his terms for those three aspects. And what happened, curiously, there was a booklet that we had for years been putting on these things called the David Bohm seminars in Ojai, where we would invite David and Cyril to come. This was after Krishnamurti had died. And we would have 40 or 50 people join in and discuss all of these things that David was interested in any particular year. And the underlying feature of those seminars was this whole question of the self-image, and really more thoroughly and properly said, the self-world image. David used both terms, and he generally meant them interchangeably, but the self-world image is really much more comprehensive and brings in the flip side of the self-image. So, for instance, if we just think about our self-image, that can become very narcissistic. But if we realize that the self-image is the same as our image of the world itself, right, that these two things are one and the same, this opens up an entirely different kind of terrain. And it's a little hard initially to get your head around that idea that my image of myself and my image of the world are one and the same. But once you do, it cracks open a tremendous amount of what Bohm is trying to convey. So this is sort of the individual level, is working in many different unusual and dynamic ways, attempting to sort of unearth or dislodge a little bit the grip of the self-world image on our consciousness. You know, it's not an idea of getting rid of it. This is a tremendous mistake that is often made when people experiment in this terrain, getting rid of the self-image and so on. This was not Bohm's intention. It's possible that in certain respects for certain people that could happen as a kind of epiphenomenon of working with what he was talking about. But in some fundamental way, it's a mistaken intention really because who is it that's getting rid of the self-image? Right? What we're really doing is experimenting, exploring, investigating. How does this whole process work? And can we dislodge it a little bit and let some space come in to how that operates? And then see what happens if space enters that self-world image. So his thinking and approach to that was really quite subtle and extensive. And this is what he was referring to, in my understanding, when he said people doing his version of dialogue were not doing enough work on their own, because this is the foundation he had laid before he ever proposed the idea of dialogue. And when he did propose the idea of dialogue, it was very clearly dropped into that foundation. And so for all the people over the years that had explored that with him, that was clear. But what happened is this little booklet was made, a little booklet called On Dialogue. And it was a nicely put together, very concise, but very incomplete summary of some of his thoughts on dialogue. And that was originally sent out to people that have been coming to these David Bohm seminars. Well, it took on a life of its own, and before we knew it, we had sold 20,000 copies of that booklet. Originally, we published 100 of them, and there was more and more and more demand, and this went on and on. But one of the effects of that was that people that read that booklet had no idea that there was this deeper foundation of really intensive work with trying to understand how the self-world image operates. So this certainly became an issue as time went on, and certainly by the time that David died, he felt this we have to find some way to work with this. And I don't know how you would describe it, because we never had the chance after that last conversation to go into it in detail. But I think what really he had in mind was that if people were really interested in his approach to dialogue, it would always have a limit. And this goes to Ken Wilber's point. I think in a certain respect, Ken Wilber was right on this, that if people just come into Bohemian dialogue with a general idea that it's a group process, without this background, this earlier foundation that Bohm had laid, a number of interesting and even good things can happen. But there will be these vast divergences of what people even think we're trying to do. You see, that this is so critical with any endeavor. Do you have a common understanding of what it is you're intending to do in the first place? And if you do, the chances of a meeting of minds and developing the process are very good. But if you don't have that kind of collective understanding of the basic intention, then the likelihood of confusion in these different levels missing one another is very high. And in my experience, that happens a lot with Bohemian dialogue, because people have really not paid much attention to this foundation of working really intensively with the self-image, self-world image, and then bringing the fruit of that individual work into the dialogue. There's a strong tendency for people to think, what can dialogue do for me? But this other way of looking at it flips it. It's more like, what can I do for what can I bring to dialogue? The fruit of my individual labor. And then when you have a group of people coming together with that common intention, the effect of that is really very different from if you don't have that effect of people working on their own. So that's one piece of I think what David was concerned about in those last months of his life. And then there's the third piece, of course, of dialogue. So that working on one's own is that individual aspect of the dialogue, then coming together as the collective. Then it's almost as though that collective dislodging of the self-world image, that really opens up a vast space, at least potentially, depending on how the group proceeds and a lot of other factors. But the intention from Bohm's point of view there was that this could open up the group, the individuals in the group, however you want to formulate that space that gets created through that dislodgement of the self-world image is actually the space of the cosmos in terms of consciousness, and that these different orders of intelligence can begin to somehow engage that more habitual, limited consciousness that we use to navigate the world every day. So that's sort of opening up the cosmic aspect of the self-world image. And none of that's to say that you can't engage this cosmic if you don't do the collective dialogue. Or, I mean, we know that there are many, many ways throughout history and currently to work to explore that kind of consciousness that's more expansive and deep than the one we normally navigate the world with. So the point is not at all that there's something exclusive about that with Bohemian dialogue, but simply to indicate how these different facets of it are related to one another. And the critical part is this individual work with the self-world image.
That's really a beautiful and clear response. Thank you. I think that really meets well, in my mind, the kind of concern that I think Wilber was expressing. And I think possibly my sense of it being, not necessarily a problematic element is that I was practicing in contexts where all of that was already known and folded into the process, particularly at Krishnamurti centers. I can imagine if it's just taken into a boardroom or some other place and just used as a new method of dialogue, people might not really grasp the fullness of what it's about. I used to have that on dialogue book back when it was still in the spiral form before it had been published. And it's a beautiful book and it has a lot of wonderful insights in it, but it's also, like you said, very spare. It doesn't really contain that fuller picture.
Right. And apropos what you just mentioned, at some point it became clear how this little booklet had led to certain problems. And so after David died, we brought out a much fuller picture with the same title, On Dialogue, right? And that's still in print. It's published by Routledge, still available. And that has everything in it that was in that original small booklet, but also brings in the fuller context that we've been talking about here today.
I'm not sure I'll represent this well, so I want you to correct me if I don't. But my understanding is part of your response to that brief exchange with David Bohm and that concern around bringing in the multiple facets and really fleshing out a practice where we can engage, you could say, at micro and macro levels with self-world image and constitution, is pivoting around this concept of Bohm's holo movement or holoflux. And Bohm said that wasn't really he proposed it as maybe a non-definable term that when used could be a frame that can define other terms in the process, but nevertheless, it's something that you can get a feel for and get a sense of through description and engagement and things like that. So I want to know, he introduced, in my understanding, that concept of holo movement or holoflux, maybe first in wholeness in the implicate order. Not certain, but I think so. But anyway, I wanted to just ask if you could unpack a little bit about what is holo movement or holoflux, and then later we'll kind of go into its relationship to the dialogical project.
Right. Let's see, what's a good place to begin with this? So for many, many people throughout the world, to the extent that Bohm is known, it's through his concept of the implicate order. And of course, that's something we could spend an entire session talking about, multiple sessions, obviously. But the holo movement is really, in Bohm's description of it, it's everything that can be conceived. It's everything that thought can in some way describe to itself. It's everything that can be sensorially experienced and everything that exists that can't be sensorially experienced. It's specifically and definitely not something that people may associate with, to use Bohm's term, the unlimited. The holoflux is not what he meant by the unlimited. It's just this side of that, but it's everything that's just this side of that. Many people attach the word God to these kinds of concepts and so on. And Bohm's view of that was, we can do that, but we're probably wasting time when we talk about God. We're probably wasting time if we talk very much about the unlimited. We can only kind of come up against it, because as soon as we have concepts and are talking about it, we've turned the unlimited into the limited. So it wasn't like he had this absolute sense that we never talk about the unlimited, but it's only under certain very careful circumstances that you would do that. So the holo movement is everything just this side of the unlimited. And the holo movement or holoflux is everything, it's what all implicate orders arise from. So that in a Bohmian perspective, there wasn't just one implicate order. There are many variations and combinations and permutations of what he meant by that term and how he used that term, implicate order. But any version that we, pluck out of his work with regard to the implicate order, any and every version of that arises out of this holo movement. It's a kind of not quite totality. He was a little nervous about using that term to describe the holo movement, but it's something in that vicinity. So then what is the relationship of the holo movement to the holoflux? Well, first, let's just look at the words that he brought together for either one of those terms. So the movement is very, very important in everything Bohm ever did. And for people that knew him or have read his biography, you know that from the time he was a young child, that he really came to understand things through his own bodily process, through this participatory engagement with the world and feeling his way into all kinds of things that for other people were just concepts. So this left a very deep impression on him, and it's obvious throughout all of his work that remained the way that he cognized, right? It was a very somatic, body-oriented approach to everything he did in physics and everything he did with relation to the self-world image and dialogue. There's this tremendous somatic component, and if we come to talk about dialogue, we can very specifically address how the body relates to dialogue. So we have these two terms, holo movement, and that's the movement part we're talking about. So Bohm's view was that everything, it's a kind of metaphysical term for Bohm. Metaphysics just meaning thoughts about all, thoughts about everything. That's how he used the word metaphysics. And so for him, movement was a metaphysical, a kind of primary metaphysical tenet. Now, what about the holo part of holo movement? Well, that's where the hologram principle comes in, which, of course, this is a very old, ancient concept. I mean, one of the most primary versions of it that we can find in history comes from the mythic figure of Hermes Trismegistus, right? As above, so below. That's one version in which all the parts are contained within the whole, and every part has the whole contained within it, right? This is a very simple version, but it's really all that you need to know to understand what Bohm meant by holo movement. That if you imagine a cosmos in which every part is contained in the whole of it, but in some way, every part contains the reflection of that whole, and it's in perpetual movement, unrelenting perpetual movement. This is what he meant by the holo movement. So how do we get from that to the holoflux? Well, the holoflux is a term he didn't use very often, and it's never been really clear why he didn't shift to that more fundamentally, because he pointed out in an interview with the wonderful Renee Weber, who I think she was able to draw more out of David Bohm in a short time than any other person that I know of. Just marvelous engagement with him. And it was in one of her interviews with him that he said he felt that really holoflux was a better term than holo movement. And the reason for that was that holo movement, the way most people would receive that, movement tends to mean from one point to another. And flux does not carry that implication. Flux can be multi-directional all at once. It could involve transformation from one state to another, and not just some particular thing moving from one point in space to another point in space. So he made the argument to her and to himself that holoflux was a more accurate term for what he was trying to convey with it. And then he never really followed up and used holoflux in that way. But more recently, after Bohm had died, this question came up for Basil Hiley, Bohm's long-term collaborator. And in a paper he wrote, he went through kind of the same sequence that Bohm did in describing why holoflux is probably a better term. So that's sort of the basis of the languaging and the concepts and how they fit together. So with holoflux, you have this much more subtle, nuanced, multi-dimensional sensibility of movement with flux. And then you still have this hologrammatic sensibility in which all of the parts are in the whole, and every one of the parts contains the imprint of the whole.
There's a way that people could relate to holomovement or holoflux as a kind of abstract metaphysical principle applying cosmologically or, to the depth strata of a quantum picture of the universe, but keep it at a distance. But I know that for both Bohm and for you as you unpack it, there's a real experiential, an essentially experiential and somatic dimension to that. And in one of the dedications to your book, Entering Bohm's Holoflux, you mentioned that Tobasanakut Kinyu taught you to see the waving mountains in Albuquerque, which I relate to the Holoflux. Can you share anything about that experience and what you meant with that reference?
Yes, there's a kind of background and a context to that. There were a number of people, Tobasanakut among them, and of course Leroy Little Bear and Leroy's wife, Amethyst, first rider. I won't go through the long list, but the last year of David's life, the last time that I saw him face to face, we were at a dialogue in Kalamazoo, Michigan. And David Pete, who was a good friend of David Bohm, had convened a dialogue between Native American elders and Western scientists and educators and philosophers. I think there were maybe 30 people in that dialogue, which went on for a number of days. And that's where I was introduced to many indigenous people who attended that dialogue. And as I said, among them, Tobasanakut Kinyu. And for reasons that are still mysterious to me, sometimes connections forge and you don't understand how or why that happens. And that was the case with Tobasanakut and also with Leroy and his wife Amethyst. A very abiding relationship was developed out of meeting them at that dialogue. And because of that connection, I would go to Tobasanakut's territory up in Lake of the Woods in Manitoba in Canada, visit with him, and he would take me out and share with me things that he had learned as a medicine person, which was something he was engaged with till he died, which was now about 6 or 7 years ago. And then he would come to Albuquerque and we would go out and about and do all kinds of things together, exploring. He was fascinated with the land here. And, anytime you're working with indigenous people, the root is always, it's the earth, it's the land, and it's the land where you are. It's not an abstract notion of earth. It's the land where you are. And he connected very strongly to this land here. And so that took us to many places to do many types of things. So I don't know, Bruce, it was probably maybe 5 or 6 years after we've been working together in that way. We were just driving south on Interstate 25, to the east of which is the uplift of the Sandia Mountains, which is really maybe the southernmost reach of the Rockies, if they're even really part of the Rockies. That seems to be an open question. But we were driving past and he pointed up to the mountains and said, "Do you see those mountains? Do you see they're waving? Do you see they're like waves in the ocean?" Well, it was a big shock. You know, in one sense, it's self-evident. Anybody can drive down that road and look up and see that that's the case. And geologically, people speak about, you know, the waving nature of mountains. But in this case, what happened was I'm hearing that from someone, how would you put it? He lives that way. It's not an isolated, interesting, momentary concept. This is the world he lives in, that everything is waving constantly. He himself and everything that he's participating with is waving. So he just kind of plucked out this one patently obvious thing to call my attention to it, perhaps hoping to create a little bit of a shock, which that is what happened, whether it was his intention or not. And it really changed many things about understanding some of what indigenous people feel about the earth, about the land, and understanding suddenly a great deal more about what David Bohm was working with. So there was a lot that got folded into that one moment. So I'm glad you brought that up.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And in our conversation, I'm hoping to kind of like weave and wave through several of the different concepts, maybe not very linearly, but reflecting them off of each other in terms of the holoflux and dialogue and thoughts. So in my next kind of like question or inquiry I'd like to open here is, you know, in Vervaeke, John Vervaeke's work on the meaning crisis, one of the ways toward greater wisdom and well-being is through the reclamation of perspectival and participatory modes of knowing. And so I think this insight and intuition of his relates closely to Bohm's notion of the holoflux and what you're doing with that, especially as it can be realized experientially by the individual or collectively by individuals in dialogue. And so I want to keep circling around that. But one thing I wanted to ask you about is setting some context here. Bohm's discussion of thought, particularly for the roles that it plays in individual and collective fragmentation, may relate more closely to the sense of the meaning crisis itself, the nature and the dynamics of the meaning crisis. So I wanted to ask you, if we could just, take a little dip into looking at thought and what Bohm meant by that. My sense of it is he held it in a very broad, integral way. It's not just subjective. It's not just in the head. And he brings in some useful distinctions for this kind of work that you're doing with, between thinking and thought and feeling and felts. And, so just like to invite some unpacking of that if you can. What is thought from a Bohmian perspective, and why is it getting us into trouble?
Well, maybe one place to begin with that is just the word itself, thought. So if we have thinking and we have thought, thinking would be the present tense activity, and thought would be that which has been thought. Thought would be the past. So in the simplest sense, the Bohmian use of thought would mean that we're always having a filter from the past. Now, he didn't use that in a pejorative sense. He just used it in a descriptive sense, right? This was his approach. If we're going to try to understand these things, we can't take a kind of polarized attitude where we say thought is bad. The minute we say that, we've lost our ability to understand what it is. And my experience has been, limited though it is, that many people that approach these kinds of questions about thought do tend to slip into this tacit pejorative judgment of thought within themselves and within other people. Maybe some of this comes from some of the presentations even that we get from Krishnamurti, where he was very strong, thought is the enemy of man. And he could be very, very strong in his assessments of these things, particularly with regard to thought. And David took a more, how would we say, at least in my experience, a less judgmental, a less severe attitude, a more experimental. Let's find out how it's actually working, which of course Krishnamurti did that too. I don't at all mean to dismiss his perspective on it, but just to point out that the way we receive some of the ways these things are talked about can have a long-term effect that can inhibit us. So one of the things I really appreciated and still do about David's approach was he always came at these things with very little judgment, trying to understand carefully. And again, this can we dislodge a little bit and unearth how thought as the past is filtering our experience. So then there's the question of thinking, and a lot of people are surprised to hear this about David, but if you go through his work carefully, he was pretty clear that in his provisional approach to these things, that thinking had great potential, that thinking in its present tense actually derives from the depth of certain implicate orders of consciousness, very deep and not filtered by the past, at least not in the way that thought is filtered, is the past really superimposing itself onto the whole field of experience. So let's bring in another term here that he used that might be helpful, which is collective representations. Now, he actually borrowed this term from his friend Owen Barfield. And Barfield's work in this terrain is really, it's very profound and very subtle, and also very difficult to penetrate because Barfield's writing style is somewhat obscure. But in any event, David took this term collective representations from Owen Barfield to augment his own thinking about thought and thinking. So let's see, what would be maybe the briefest way to get at this. So the collective representations, it's really the hardened, concretized, historically inherited concepts that we all grow into in any culture. It's unavoidable. Nobody exists without these. It doesn't matter whether you're talking about people in the current United States, or whether you're talking about ancient Greeks, or whether you're talking about indigenous people. All cultures have these inherited collective representations. And just as an aside, one of our collective representations in contemporary society is that I have a me. And we think, well, of course, that's patently obvious. That's not a representation. That's just the fact. But to come back to Owen Barfield, he's demonstrated to me rather persuasively, and other people have done similar work, that there were vast periods in human culture, both historically and prehistorically, in which what we think of as the me did not exist. This interior entity, this sharp distinction between me and the world, it did not exist. So that's one collective representation that's current for most of us now, is having the self. So in any event, to get back to the thought and thinking, these collective representations are the sum total of thought for any particular culture, what has been thought and superimposed on the living world. So Bohm really took this to an extreme, which is baffling for many people. But if you work with it, a lot of interesting things come out of it. For example, he talks about, well, if you get in your car and start driving, he says the road and the concrete, that's thought. You drive past the post office, that's thought. You look up at the telephone lines, that's thought. The airplane that's flying overhead, that's thought. And by that, he doesn't mean that you're having thoughts about them as they're happening. You could include that too, because that's obvious. What he meant was all of those things are the concrete manifestations that came at one time from thinking, which might have been very creative, inventive, coming out of insight, but now they've been concretized into the so-called objective world, that is the world made of objects that we experience on a daily basis. And so our collective representations tell us this is how a world works. This is how a world is put together. So in that way, the collective representations are really just the sum total of what Bohm meant by thought. So thought is both this memory process of the past that's circulating in our so-called individual consciousness and circulating in the collective consciousness. That thought is also the concrete reality that we've constructed around us. And that concrete reality is constantly feeding back in and confirming, oh yes, this is a world. Oh yes, this is how everything is put together. And we all know and understand that. And anything we want to talk about philosophically or meditatively or contemplatively is occurring within that world. So what Bohm and Barfield equally were interested to do, and many other people, of course, is to begin to uproot a little bit or even a lot that so-called world that everything else we do, meditating, eating, whatever it is we do, is within that world. And that world we experience as just given. So Bohm is saying that world is not just given. That world is made and constructed. It is a world of thought. And we have the capacity to begin to unearth and dislodge the entirety of the world. Right? It's a very sort of startling image, but that is what he was after in working with thought and thinking. Whereas the thinking part, you see, the power of that is, as I indicated earlier, Bohm felt that this living thinking actually derives from deep orders of the natural world, deep implicate orders, the things that create nature, the things that have created the world that this overlay has been imposed on, right? the view from there is not that we're locked into this world of thought, but that potentially we can enter a different world of true thinking. We could say awareness, not that those two are the same, but they're related. And those qualities of consciousness are deriving from something other than the world of thought, which is the world that we assume to be the basic reality of everything, but which Bohm was unwilling to assume is the basic reality. So that's a mouthful, but maybe you have a sense of where we could go from there.
Yeah, definitely. That's really helpful in bringing to mind a couple different things. One, in cognitive science right now, there's a lot of talk about extended mind and distributive cognition, and looking at how different artifacts in our world feature as part of our cognitive process. And I think that's approaching what Bohm is suggesting, but what Bohm is suggesting actually is even really more radical than that, more comprehensive than that, where, talk about the extended mind, might talk about how cell phones and TVs and other things enter into our thinking process, into our cognitive process. But, so I think that's a layer of it. That's a layer of what Bohm is talking about. But I think there are many scales at which you can hold, what Bohm is suggesting. I don't know if it's one of my first kind of experiences. I want to just share a little experience that's a micro scale. See if if it's on target with that. I remember when I was at the Krishnamurti school in India, I used to regularly go out and take walks and walk through the river, by the riverside, through the forest, and just watch the movement of thought. And so often I wouldn't be actively engaged in or lost in thinking, but thinking would be arising, and I would be trying to, pay attention to it. And sometimes you go off on various trains and then you come back. That's the normal thing. So I was doing that kind of walk through the forest, and at one point I noticed I was seized by anxiety, and I didn't know why I was suddenly, afraid. And I started looking around to see if there was anything in the forest that was like maybe a danger or something going on. And I didn't see anything, you could say, possibly arising through the intelligence of thinking in that moment, which was, a fuller, sensory engagement with that. I didn't see any source for the fear, but I traced back my pattern of thinking, and I realized that as I had turned, a bend in the pathway, there had been a certain framing of trees that at that moment I traced my thoughts backwards. And at that time, it wasn't a verbal thought, but I saw that momentarily a little image had popped up in my mind that was an echo of the shape of the framing of the pathway of, through the trees. And it was my junior high school hallway, that somehow the shape of the trees had reminded me of walking through the junior high school hallway, where I had just moved out to the country from the city. I was the target by all the country kids, and there was a good chance of being bullied any day walking down the junior high school hallway. So that arose for me as a felt, right? That's the way I'm thinking about it, that was a felt that just, it replayed itself and it colored the whole field, but it wasn't really part of my active feeling, my active thinking. It was the past recording arising and imposing a kind of filter on that moment.
Right. And I think what you're bringing out, it simply points to what we all experience constantly in some version or another, in some variation or another, whether we're aware of it or not. And this is the key thing. You are able to somehow trace that back and see it, but often we're not. We're just overtaken, even if it's just in a subtle way. We kind of become infused with all kinds of moods and sensibilities that don't seem to have an immediate cause, but they would, in one way or another, in many cases, as you point out, be coming from past experiences. And it's good also that you bring out this word felt, because this is the flip side of thought, right? So there's thinking and thought, and there's feeling and felt. Again, in the Bohmian scheme of things. So the felts would be things that have occurred to you in the past. They could be traumatic or unpleasant, or they could be wonderful and beautiful. In both cases, they're kind of recordings. They're imprinted into our consciousness. And by consciousness, we're not just talking about in the head. In a Bohmian view of consciousness, it's entire body. Right? The consciousness is circulating in and through the whole body. So with the felts, that's old impressions that are circulating, and it's so innate to us that it's very hard to have a vision of being in the world without those. So much of how we assign value and what we choose to engage with and what we think is important is rooted in these thoughts and these felts. And then one of the questions that comes up is, what kind of world would we experience if the figure and ground were shifted, if we were more in thinking and more in feeling than in thought and felt? So your experience gives us an excellent illustration of how that can work.
Yeah, I think it's a really, important point that we're immersed in that all the time. And that was just for me one moment where it stood out clearly that, oh, this is how it's happening, right? And the kind of the first glimmering of tracing down that genesis of that moment for me. One of the things that Bohm talks about, I think you made a really important point, and I'm grateful for that, about not talking pejoratively about thought or about its operation, or about maybe the me or the self. But I recall Bohm sometimes talking about an evolutionary wrong turn or some kind of evolutionary fixation, which led to a certain configuration of the human mind and consciousness in the way of participating in the world that seems to generate a kind of smog or pollution downstream in consciousness. And I think that's related partly to what we're talking about here. But in your booklet that we're discussing also, of the Entering Bohm's Holoflux, you talk about poetically, but not only poetically, I think, about the old one and the importance of meeting the old one. I wanted to ask you, is there any connection or any differentiation also that you can trace between what Bohm might have meant by this evolutionary fixation or wrong turn, and what you mean by the old one and the importance of contacting the old one?
Well, as you say, Bruce, in that booklet, I'm using that term somewhat poetically, but also heuristically, to try to point to something. Let's go back just briefly to help elucidate this point to where we were a little earlier in the conversation. So we've been talking about this thought and the collective representations and how built in they are and how very strongly they filter and color everything that we experience. I think it's the case that many, many, many people, I don't have any idea how to quantify it. But we know through history there are endless accounts, and we know just from our interaction with our friends and family, many people have moments when this edifice of the world cracks. And there we are in the presence of something we don't have words for. We do feel it, and then afterward we may assign all kinds of terms to it. But in that moment, when that whole edifice of collective representations and thought cracks or is dislodged somewhat, and that space opens, we know directly, without reference to anything else, that there's some kind of vast horizon that reaches infinitely beyond what we typically experience through those filters. And different people will describe this in different ways. But simply to say, this is not an uncommon experience for human beings. It's not an uncommon experience at all. And yet, what tends to happen is, in fairly short order, those old collective representations will close back over again, and those open cracks will close. And then that experience, by and large, becomes another memory. But the main point is that many people have these kinds of experiences. And this is related to this question, or this poetic use of the term, the old one. For me, there is a feeling of something so ancient in those moments as to be timeless. And paradoxically, it's also the freshest, newest quality that one could possibly ever experience. And yet it feels ancient beyond time, both at the same time. One of the many paradoxes that can come up in this territory. So what I'm trying to suggest in the booklet in that regard with that kind of term is simply that we're not necessarily ultimately forever locked into these collective representations to thought, but that there may be the opportunity for human beings to keep dislodging thought, to keep dislodging and unearthing the collective representations, which opens the possibility that this old one, this indefinable ancient power, energy, beauty, movement, can then flow through those cracks. And, well, we could leave it at that for now. Hopefully that gets a little bit at what you were wondering about there.
It does very much. Thank you. Yeah, I felt really there was almost a transmission there in the way that you presented that. I could really feel and connect to that. In Bohm's work, sometimes he talks about the newness of our thinking capacity in evolutionary terms, the relative recent development of our frontal cortex and our thinking reflective capacity, and the need to develop proprioception of thought to become more aware of, using Barfield's term, those collective representations and the activity of thoughts and felts. But we need to develop, in my understanding of how he's using that, proprioception of thought, and that dialogue is a good vehicle for beginning to do that if done, in the right way and carefully. And I wanted to ask if you could, maybe unfold that a little bit for us in terms of what is proprioception of thought and what is its relationship to the dialogical process and to what we've been talking about with the old one and the deep participatory, implicate thinking process, that whole picture.
Right. Let's see. Well, let's look at the word first, proprioception. In its simplest physiological sense, it means that, if I have a mosquito bite on my shoulder blade back here, I don't have to have a mirror behind me and a mirror in front of me to show me where to put my finger, right? The body knows right where to go. That's proprioception. If you're walking down steps, assuming that the steps are all of equal depth, you don't have to look at the steps. You might with the first one, but once you've made the first step and you have this tacit assumption that they're all of the same depth, you don't need to look anymore. Your body knows how to keep walking up or down steps of the same depth. So these are just simple, basic examples of proprioception. So David wondered to himself, is it possible that the thought process, which in his scheme of things creates enormous problems in our life because it presents things to us that may or may not have anything to do with what's actually going on in the world. It gives us these images that create fear and anger and all kinds of disturbances. And he wondered if we may have some latent capacity to engage all those confusing images and what they do in our body and our consciousness. Do we possibly have a latent capacity to shift how that's working, that there could be some kind of intelligent shift in those habitual patternings of thought? Now, whether he meant that term literally as the same thing as physiological proprioception, I don't really know. I don't think he would have insisted on sticking with that term if people wanted to think about what he was trying to talk about and use some different terminology. I think he would have been fine with that. So just to be clear that we're not saying that there is this thing called proprioception of thought, right? That's where we get into trouble when we take any of these experimental inquiries and then try to make them algorithmic, right? If we do A and then we do B and then we do C, just as David Bohm talked about it, I mean, maybe there are people that actually get extraordinary experiences from that, but the danger is that it's just thought again, being mechanical. Thought loves algorithms. Tell me what to do, right? Proprioception of thought, yes, okay, I've got that. So let's now do proprioception of thought. When Bohm himself held this much more experimentally and as a loose inquiry, even though he really felt there was something to it, it wasn't totally speculative for him. He felt there was good reason to do it because it seemed to have, it reveals things when you go down that path. But let's look a little more at what he was indicating, whatever we want to call it, proprioception or anything else. Let's see, what is a kind of thumbnail version? So let's say that I'm with a group of friends and someone in that group starts talking about some political issue. And let's say that they have a highly favorable view of our recent president in the United States, who, from my perspective, has created tremendous chaos, not just in the consciousness of people in the United States, but throughout the world. A very, very dangerous human being, in my personal opinion. So I have that personal opinion, and yet my friend over here thinks very highly of that former president and starts enumerating the good qualities in this person. You can see I even just lifted myself in my chair because I'm already getting slightly agitated because I'm describing something that's happened, right? It's not hypothetical. And so even the memory of this, what's happening is my blood's flowing faster, even just from the memory. My heartbeat's picked up. My muscles are tensing. All these things that we associate with fight or flight mechanism. So what's going on with that? What's happening with that process? When I'm in the room with this friend and he's talking about these things in a way that's disturbing to me, he's not about to attack me physically. So why is it that my body starts responding as if a bear is in the room and may be about to attack me? Why is that? That's one of the questions involved with proprioception. And then even more curiously, just remembering that event creates the same kind of response. And one of the interesting things that Bohm proposed vis-a-vis proprioception is that you do this on purpose. You know, when you're not in the real situation, which often can get too intense for your awareness to stick with it, you can just be overtaken with emotion and thoughts and emotion talking to themselves and ratcheting up everything, right? So you think, this guy is really foolish, deeply foolish. And so when that word foolish reverberates in one's consciousness, that in itself can start stirring up the blood. And when the blood is stirred up, what is the message of that? The message of that is there's danger. And when there's a feeling of danger and it fuses with the concept he's foolish and he's dangerous, that's the kind of thing that Bohm was saying we need proprioception to engage that process. There's a mistake happening, right? There are all kinds of attributions and energy processes that have gotten hooked up in very unhappy and unfortunate ways. And if we can, of course, then force ourselves to calm down. We have 100 strategies for masking that kind of process that I just described, or suppressing it and moving on and forgetting it, although it gets lodged and impressed in the consciousness somewhere. We have millions and millions of these impressions. And so every time a new set of circumstances comes up, we've become very hardwired, in Bohm's view, to respond in the way that I've described. So this can often be so intense that it's very difficult to be with it when it's happening. So he said, wait until the next day or something, and you're sitting in your house and you're calm, and then sit and call it up again on purpose. And my wife has said more than once, why would I do that on purpose? And it's a perfectly reasonable question. But the reason Bohm suggested this is that you may be able to get an insight a little bit easier when you're not in the heat of the moment. So one more step in this. So a day later, I'm sitting down and I'm remembering these things that my friend has said that I think are not only stupid and misguided, but dangerous, right? So I'm remembering all of this. And so all these processes get called up. Heart beats faster, the muscles tense, and the thoughts about not just my friend who's saying these things that I think are potentially dangerous, but what they're in reference to, right? This former president. who I think is dangerous then and now. And so it's very easy then that you can set these things in motion with very little effort. This is not some subtle esoteric thing. It's very easy to. In fact, we often wake up in the middle of the night and it's happening involuntarily, and it takes us 2 hours to get back to sleep because all the energy in the body is suddenly awakened and gone into this kind of emergency state. So it's easy to do this. But the key thing is that we have these strategies, right? I mean, they're ubiquitous in our culture, and to some extent it's correct. If we didn't have some kind of strategy for containing emotional explosions, you can see where that would go. So I'm not trying to totally dismiss having certain suppressive or management strategies around these issues. But for Bohm, we're never going to understand this unless we get to the bottom of it, right? This is what you were talking about earlier, this kind of pollution at the source. That if all we have is management, somehow this is all building up under the surface, both individually and collectively. And that's why we have wars. It's why we have fights with individuals. It's why we have so much anger in this culture right now. It only takes somebody that knows how to push those buttons, which is what we've had, to draw out this anger that's been accumulating for millennia, right? It's there, it's in us, it's waiting. And so we see where that goes, which is not to say that people on the other side of the political spectrum from the former president don't do this. Of course we do. This is something from Bohm's perspective that we all have. If we start pointing fingers and say it's only them, we're lost. We can't possibly do what David was trying to get us to do, which is to understand it all the way down, to plummet down like a plumb line all the way to its root. So to get back to the one key point, if we don't have these strategies for managing it, what are we going to do? Because the manager, the one who would manage my disturbances, the manager is me, and they're my disturbances. So it's really good to get to that point where you understand that these things are happening, and you maybe see, well, managing them is fine as far as it goes, maybe even necessary, but I do see that it's not going to get me to the root. So the next step would be to see how strong the reflex is to manage these movements of consciousness, right? As a full movement, we'll call it that, the movement of consciousness in this, aberrant mode of creating fight and flight disturbances when apparently there's nothing that warrants that. So we have two things going on there. One is that this is in motion, it's moving. The thoughts and the feelings keep ratcheting one another up and perpetuating one another. And then there's me watching. There's me back here somewhere watching all of that happen. Well, that's very strongly built into us to do that. That's what we've got, right? We can't just eliminate that. But in Bohm's view, that's where we really have to begin to work, is to see that even if we acknowledge that the management strategies or the suppression strategies are insufficient, the root of that whole managing process is still in place, which is me watching it, right? So one thing that's very useful in Bohm is to find out where you cannot do what he's talking about, right? For instance, in dialogue, one of the basic elements is you suspend your assumptions about whatever it may be. Well, I've worked with dialogue for years, and I'm saying, I can't do this. It's a nice idea, and maybe I could suspend a little assumption over here, and maybe I could. But in general, if it's anything, that means anything to me, sorry, David, I can't do it. I can't suspend those assumptions. And this went on for years. And then one day the light went on. That's what I need to know. That's where the gold is. I can't suspend assumptions. Well, what is that telling me? It's telling me their power, right? It's showing me how powerful they are. And so that I need a different approach than I'm going to suspend the assumption. And it's the same thing with this movement of thought and feeling. We have to come to a point where we see that one, the me, that's going to do something with it, whether it's manage it or suppress it or massage it or love it or whatever we think we're going to do with it, that fails. And if we come to see that move, that architecture of consciousness fails, then maybe something different can show up. And what Bohm proposed was that the movement of thought and feeling in a circuit, the movement of it, here we're back to holo movement, holoflux, the movement of it, the flux of it, the movement of thought and felt can be aware of itself, which is very, very different from me back here doing any of these strategies with it. This is a completely different way of conceiving the whole process. But where does that leave me? It leaves me out, right? Now, of course, I'm still there, and I'm still somehow reflexively always going to try to engage with anything and everything, including this process that I'm learning from David Bohm. But if you have enough failure with that, at least this is my experience, then at some point you begin to take seriously what sounds rather preposterous, that the movement of thought and feeling can actually regulate itself. And in the end, it's the presence of this mischievous me in the background that keeps injecting memory into this whole process. And if somehow that could recede further and further and become very quiet through failure, that's how it works for me. Again and again, I have to come to not a conceptual recognition of the failure that the me can do this, but a concrete body knowing that it doesn't work. It doesn't work. I have to keep coming to that again and again and again. That has not gotten hardwired yet, like the me reflex is hardwired, so to speak. But in those times when this me becomes very quiet and maybe sometimes just takes a total vacation, it's rather astonishing that something like what David Bohm talked about is really true. That this whole thought feeling process is innately, naturally self-regulating, and on its own will not go into this kind of madness that we're talking about, where you're ready to attack someone when there's no physical threat to you whatsoever. It's all conceptual and driven by these energy patterns. So again, that's a mouthful there and all of that, and I hope it's at least somewhat clear. It's this movement of thought and feeling being self-aware rather than you being aware of it. That's what Bohm meant by proprioception.
Yeah, that is very clear. And whether it's thinking or thought, I've got so much popping in my mind right now that I want to respond to that. There's so many threads to follow at the same time. One thing it put me in mind of was an insight that came to me, that same kind of aha that came to me when I was at the Krishnamurti school. And Krishnamurti always talked about choiceless awareness. And often it was a kind of struggle in the dialogue sessions of, it was always seemingly being framed, not by Krishnamurti, but by all those of us in the dialogue sessions, as something we're either successfully doing or not. And somehow it just popped clear to me that awareness itself is choicelessly present. It's not something that the self is doing or not doing. It's not something that thought or the me is doing or not doing. In fact, that's just all happening up here, whereas awareness is choicelessly present already. There's nothing that needs to be done to introduce choicelessness into the situation. So I relate that to what you're seeing about the me manager thinking that there's something to do, in contrast to realizing kind of already the awareness and the presence of thinking and feeling that doesn't need that external management or coordination.
Right. I think we're very much talking about the same thing there. Quite right.
I teach a class called Paradigms of Consciousness, and it's one of my favorite classes to teach. We talk about living systems theory and quantum theory and even a little bit of TSK and indigenous perspectives and Bohmian dialogue. And so it's a big smorgasbord of ideas that is introduced at the beginning of my program, the program at JFK, that kind of sets up core concepts that will then go out and inform multiple different kinds of classes. So it's a introductory kind of survey class. But in the discussion of Bohm's work and Bohmian dialogue, I wanted to, get your reflection on this in the way that I'm framing it, because I think that you were describing something like this. We have a sense in our time right now that mindfulness is something that we should be doing. That we need, there's an interest, a strong interest, not only in spiritual culture, but also in different forms of therapy now, greater attention to developing some kind of mindfulness practice. But Ken Wilber and some other people have been pointing out also, we've got to be careful not to treat mindfulness as some kind of panacea, that there are certain things that mindfulness will help us become mindful of. There are certain things that it will disclose, but other things that particular way of engaging won't disclose. It won't really make our shadow, our unconscious, very present to us. We might be aware of the rising of thought, but we might not, through mindfulness by itself, see the conditioning that underlies the kind of thoughts that are coming up. And so different shadow work processes such as therapy and things like that are important. But the way I frame it in the class is that I think Bohm is proposing something that is not vipassana or mindfulness. It's not therapy. It's not group process, but it's a collective intersubjective process that has the potential to help us get new insight into cultural conditioning and fault lines and these kind of collective inheritances that are influencing and shaping us, and over which we often don't have control, which is what I was thinking is what you're saying, is that aha moment that you had in, okay, I can't just suspend that assumption, but that process of dialogue and what happens after dialogue is what helps you see those deep underlying assumptions much more clearly, that are connected not only individual to your biographical self, but I think culturally to our whole meaning matrix in a particular time and place.
Right. Well, there's a lot in what you just brought up, Bruce. Let's just look briefly at mindfulness. As you know, there's an entire mindfulness industry. And I have a friend, I think we have a common friend, who is a severe critic of that whole process. And we have fun with it. I call it his jihad, his holy war against mindfulness, because our view is a little bit different, not as much as it might seem when we banter about it. But there are, to me, concerns about mindfulness. And I think at the core of my concern is that one of the intentions of mindfulness, as it's often presented, is to become calm and acquire certain peacefulness. And that's good on its face. But what can happen, and I fear does often happen, is if you become skilled at being calm and peaceful, you're likely to actually be more adjusted to things that we as human beings shouldn't become adjusted to, like the way the culture is evolving right now. If I'm too calm and peaceful, then I'm going to be okay with that. I might have, certain objections, but the depth, the import of the things that are happening can't penetrate my calm. Right? This is another part of the old one, that if we want to have some deep contact and participation with our own humanity, we have to be able to experience the pain of the world, and not just, something that moves me deeply that I see in a 4-minute segment on TV. Not to belittle that, that's important too, but a much more sustained opening, that we're open to the depth of the confusion and pain and suffering in the world collectively. So that's hard, right? Nobody likes to hold all that. And yet, if we become too calm and peaceful, we may become master strategists tacitly, where it becomes second nature to filter all that out. This is one of the things that can go wrong with mindfulness. Another thing that can happen is I become, this is what we talked about early, the difference between Bohm's term self-image and then the self-world image. There's a risk with the term self-image, just like there's a risk with mindfulness. Well, what's it about? It's about me. And then what else is it? It's about me. And then what else is it? It's about me. I'm paying a lot of attention to myself, right? In a very superficial way. But having said that, I don't have the same kind of objections that some of my friends do to mass teaching of mindfulness. There are all these pitfalls and all these problems, and I know they're real. But my gut feeling, and I could be very wrong, I would like to see more evidence that I'm wrong, honestly. But my gut feeling is that the net effect of a lot of teaching about mindfulness is probably good. It's just a guess. It's a gut feeling based on no evidence in a concrete way at all. So I think the key thing is that it's important to keep the discussion going, right? And the critiques going, and attention to, well, what is mindfulness really doing in the culture? It's very important to keep that going. And for all the reasons that you mentioned, which, they dovetail very nicely with what I've been trying to convey. The shadow in the human being, well, maybe that gets filtered out because I don't want to see the darker parts of myself. And the deeper versions of that running through the whole connectivity of the race. And other aspects that you had brought in that may get ignored if we only work with mindfulness.
Yeah, I think all of them have value, and what I want in my own engagement with Bohm's work with my students, which is again not a very deep level, but is for Bohmian work not to be conflated with the others. It has its own kind of unique laboratory that it sets up that I think is valuable, and that mindfulness itself. I also don't have necessarily the data, but overall, I feel like mindfulness is a good thing to engage, and it's a good thing to be introduced into culture, despite those kind of risks that our mutual friend points out very well. Therapy is very important. Shadow work is very important. And I just, yeah, what Bohm, I think, has introduced is not easily just reducible to some of the other familiar processes. And so I think it needs to be honored for kind of a unique contribution. It's not just group process. It's something, I think that's valuable, that we should not, sideline or just equate too easily with other kinds of familiar processes.
Right. No, I think it's really a very astute and important point about Bohm's approach, that it is certainly not mindfulness. Now, if you engage in it and become interested in it and kind of attune to that style of inquiry, you will become mindful. You can't proceed without, in the most general sense of mindfulness, that you're kind of softly and gently aware in a peripheral way, in a 360-degree way, through whatever means. You're not instantly and constantly reactive to everything, and you're open to seeing things that may be uncomfortable. All these, it's part of what I think of as mindfulness, not what's taught in the factories of mindfulness, but just what it basically is. So there are none of these techniques for becoming calm, peaceful, and so on with Bohm's approach. They're not there. Now, to come full circle to what you raised in the very beginning of our conversation, it may be that a person is interested in Bohm's work or interested in dialogue, and you take to heart what he says. People are not doing enough work outside of the dialogue. Well, even though, in my view, he was definitely referring to his own corpus of work around thought and thinking, that could also mean that you found that you can't quite keep going with Bohm, because you do become so reactive when you do the things that he talks about. So that maybe outside of a dialogue on your own, a little bit of mindfulness training could actually help, right? I'm not necessarily recommending that, but simply to say that those things are not a given, as you point out with Bohm. There's a particular style that he has, which, if I were to try to define it simply, it would be a kind of contemplative inquiry, right? That you're exploring, you're searching, you're looking, you're curious, you're agile, and you're open to surprise. And yet it does have a particular orientation, right? It's not just inquiry into all and everything that could go in any direction at any moment. It's oriented toward this question of thought, thinking, the self-world image, the self-world view, and all of that. So it does have a style that's somewhat unique to itself. In that, I would concur with you 100%.
I'm a little mindful of our time. I actually am really enjoying the conversation and could keep going, but I don't know how long listeners can keep going. So I wanted to try to bring it around to, the Holoflux question again and kind of round off our conversation here. One earlier you mentioned, the importance, of feeling the pain and the world's pain. And in your booklet on entering Bohm's Holoflux, you I think you apologize a little bit for bringing in Eckhart Tolle's notion of pain body, but I don't think that needed any apology at all. I think that was really appropriate and a very beautiful part of your overall presentation, and I think that's really key. And the seems to me the thrust of that booklet is that, there's for the micro and the cosmic scales, enveloping, bracketing the dialogue process, we can engage in, holoflux kind of inquiry and exploration of what you call the rheosoma, the flowing body. And you introduced, I loved your description of experiencing our body as kind of the little tips of the implicate order. Um, so that aligns, and this channel is associated in part with the integral movement, and one way that integral thinkers often conceive of the individual is as these little tips of the whole universal unfolding, the whole evolutionary journey from Big Bang or wherever, that all of us now are the little tips of that holistic movement. So I think there's a lot of consonance there, and people will probably in this community really appreciate what you're talking about. So I want to just, the last little bit here, to invite you to just unpack a little bit more. What are you doing and seeking with the kinds of experiential practices and inquiries that you're developing around Holoflux? And I don't want to pack too much into one question, but at the very end of the book, you mentioned that you'd like to see others experimenting in this territory also, not just relying on the map, but building richer maps through this kind of inquiry. So just like to hear your thoughts on what you're doing, what you're attempting, and where you'd like to see it go.
Well, I think at the root of it is the meaning of the term holoflux, what it actually points to, not just as a concept, but what I'm currently understanding it to mean. And that is, as Bohm suggests, that the whole is in the part and the part is in the whole. So if we take it seriously, not just as a kind of nice, fuzzy, new age concept, but if we take it seriously, that the whole is in the part, well, what does that mean? What could it mean? Let me drink of water here. So it was wondering about that and thinking about that. What would it really mean in my life? Not ideas that are swirling around in my head, but in the way that I live. What would it mean if there's something to that the whole of the cosmos is in me? And of course, meaning by that in you and in every being that exists, everything that exists, that each in its own way, after a fashion, as they say, carries the whole of the cosmos within them. So I thought, let's experiment. This is kind of the imprint, the influence of Bohm. Let's experiment. Let's see. Not in a clinical, objective way, not that kind of science, but more of a feeling, engagement, sensibility. Even though Bohm was a scientist, the way he worked with these things, as we said, was very much body-based and participatory, in which he knew that this idea of an objective observer collapses at some point. So when we take a Bohmian approach to inquiring and experimenting, it's participatory. It's not this objectivist perspective. It's fully participatory. So that's layered into how I approach this question. What would it really mean? What would it mean to my life if it's true that the whole of the cosmos is in me and in you and in everyone? So what I began to do, I thought, I have to begin close, right? If I start thinking about the out there, I'm probably going to be lost again. So what does it mean? If it's in here, then it's in here. What does that mean? So I started just paying a lot more attention to all the movements in the body, relying and trusting again this whole idea of movement and this movement in the body. And there's a word for that that covers it somewhat generally. It's interoception or interoception. People pronounce it differently. I never heard of that term before I started this experiment, but then I found out later that this covers a lot of the same territory. So it's waking up to the movement that we are, as Bohm would say, soma significantly, the movement of thought, the movement of feeling, the movement of energy, flowing of blood, electricity. It's just innate. It's what we are. It's what we're constituted of, but we're normally not very in touch with that. So the first step in the whole Holoflux approach was to stabilize in that and work with that process. So the term that I came up with, again, sort of following Bohm, was rheosoma, the flowing body. He often used these roots and etymologies to create terms that indicated what he was after. So that's what I did with this interoceptive faculty. Before I heard that word, I thought of it as rheosoma. But then it's not just here in this body. What we continued, and we have a group of about 30 people that have been working with this for a year now, and what we continually work with is through that moving body, through that flowing body that we are, we attend to the flowing movements in the so-called outer world. Like the first thing that came up for me was clouds. And so through this flowing body that I am, I'm sensing the flowing movement of the clouds. It's not through the eyes that I'm watching the flowing movement of the clouds, although the eyes are involved. It's through the whole of this flowing body, of which the eyes are a subset. So through the whole of that, I'm sensing the movement of the clouds, and this kind of infinity loop very quickly gets established. And many people get a sense of vertigo when they work with this, which is really good, right? It's an indicator that you're definitely shifting out of your typical subject-object mode, and there's a kind of participatory engagement through, if we just use an image of the figure 8 or an infinity loop in which we're participating in the movement of the cloud and the cloud is participating in our movement. So that whole process we call rheosoma, the flowing body, because the body, as it turns out, is not just this body, it's all of the bodies and how they're all engaged with one another constantly in permutations and combinations that are really endless. So that's the real larger flowing body. And so, as you were saying earlier, it is this body that's the tip, right? And it's just an image, it's a way of thinking about it, but in a certain way it's true. That this body, this individual with this name Lee, if we engage in the world in this way, it starts to reveal much more subtle movements and orders in the world that we typically miss, different processes, different energy patterns. And of course, this is one of the things that indigenous people, many carry innately. How much that's the case once the languages start to go away, I don't know. It's an open question that many people talk about. But certainly historically, this goes back again to the beginning when Toba Sonequit said to me, look at those mountains, they're waving, they're moving like mountain waves. The reason that was such a total shock is because he was saying it from 20 or 30,000 years of a culture that lives that way. And that waved through him as he was pointing it out to me. And that's why it changed so many things. So there is this waving quality, this fluid, as Bohm said again, movement, this flux. And flux is also much closer to how indigenous people talk about this than just movement. So it's another place that Bohm connects with indigenous people. But it's this territory that we're trying to get into with the Holoflux experiments that we're doing as a group. And it is our so-called particular bodies. That's where we began. That's the tip. That's what we've been given. That's what we've got. And then through that, we open out into these much larger and vaster movements, but always through our own flowing body, our own rheosoma.
That's really beautifully put. Yeah, thank you. It brings to mind some old experiences of mine where I think I first touched that sensibility. I remember when I was, again, at the Krishnamurti school in India. I talked about this in another video, so anyone watching, I apologize for telling this story a second time. But while I was in India, one of my practices at that time, I used to just say, the sky is my skull, and just let myself feel that the sky is the skull, and then everything else is just this, this field in which I was participating. And really a strong sense of the flowing movement of the body and the waving of the limbs of the leaves and the movement of the clouds and the grasses. They all were this participatory, co-influencing, harmonized movement, which, was just, I think that's something that begins to work on the self-world image.
It does, Bruce. You see, that's a very key point that many people, when we talk about the rheosoma and holoflux work, they say, well, that's great. It's like a kind of entertainment. You go out in nature and you enjoy things. But it's what you just said, that if you do it in the way we've been talking about it, it actually helps to do this dislodging of the self-world image, because this is something that doesn't coordinate well with the subject-object three-dimensional structure of collective representations that we all live in. When you start moving into these processes and you do it in a sustained way, all of that, including, as you say, the self-world image, it will start to get gently dislodged and open these other possibilities if you're interested to pursue them. So it's really important that you brought that up.
I will. Thank you so much, Lee. It's been really a delight to talk to you.
Oh, thank you, Bruce. It's great always to have the opportunity to try to share some of these experiments, and lovely to meet you for the first time. I hope we can talk again. And yes, I've thoroughly engaged, thoroughly enjoyed the conversation that we've had. Thank you.